welcome to another episode of Awakening Her. Today I have Kaylor Betts with us, who is a passionate and successful life and business coach dedicated to empowering individuals to achieve optimal success in the mind, the body, home, and in business. As a dynamic host of the Awake and Winning podcast, which we're definitely going to talk about, Kaylor encourages invigorating conversations with disruptive leaders who are redefining the status quo. And so it's so interesting, Kaylor, because before I met you, I think it was like right before I met you at one of, I think it was Kid Carson's events, I saw you on social media and I was like, ugh. Like I was just like, this guy just like, rants on social media. And I started following some other people. I'm like, everyone here feels so angry. And I remember going to that event as a speaker and I was like, I feel like everyone here is angry. And then I got to know you a little bit more. And I was like, oh, he's not angry. He's just really passionate about it. So thanks for being here.
Wow, what an intro. I haven't had that one before, but I can appreciate that so much. I can appreciate the honesty. But I also can understand why you felt that way. And it's just, yeah, it's a beautiful perspective. So maybe we'll dive into that, but I'm happy to be here and let's jam. Let's do it.
Totally. So you help people become awake and win. And I know there's a story associated with this. And I just want to say too, with the perspective, the limited perspective I had of you before meeting you at that event is so interesting because online we just see snippets of people and we don't actually get to feel them, be around them, get to know them. And I know on social media and on different platforms, people see me in one way. They're like, oh, she's a boss woman or she's an intuitive, and we tend to box people in. But for the purpose of understanding your journey a little bit more, I love to hear your story of how you stepped into this role of awaken winning and helping people wake up to who they are.
Yeah. So, man, it's always so hard to touch on my story because it's so loaded. There's so many aspects to it. But to just kind of give the cliff notes and at a high level, I was someone who really struggled and was in a battle with my mind for most of my life. So I really got in my own way. I was the king of self-sabotage. Like if there was an Olympics for self-sabotage, I would have been standing on the podium in first place. And I really struggled to get out of bed in the morning. And I often say, because this was a feeling that just when I reflected on it resonated with me so much, I realized that when my alarm clock went off, I would have rather actually went back to sleep and lived in my dreams than face the reality that was my life. And that obviously really sucks to be living your life and to feel that way every single morning. And it was because I was depressed. I was anxious. I was wrestling with a lot of internal battles that I didn't understand. I was deeply wounded. I was lacking in confidence, had really strong feelings of inadequacy. But I always had this like innate desire to do something big and build something big and do something extraordinary, live an extraordinary life. But I really struggled. And then that led to me finding the way in which a lot of people deal with those and cope with those is I got into some patterns of abusing substances and abusing some very unhealthy tools that really didn't serve me and actually were quite destructive. So I joke about me being like a degenerate because like I really was for, I partied for a living. And, eventually I just realized that that didn't serve me. And my story largely has a lot to do with like being dependent on the system. So I went to what we call the professionals, the Western medical establishment. That's who you're supposed to go see when you're struggling and you're hurt and you're unhealthy. And really all they had for me was some talk therapy with some, psychiatrists or psychotherapists and prescriptions. I was prescribed ADHD medication, Vyvanse. So I was told I had a learning disability. I was on that for 2 years. I was prescribed benzodiazepines and SSRIs as well too. I actually chose to not take those. And we could talk about why there, but they're still sitting on my mom's medicine cabinet, I believe. So yeah, I was really reliant on the system and I was kind of doing what everyone told me to do. I didn't graduate high school, so everyone was kind of saying like, "Oh, you got to like go back and upgrade and you got to go to college and you got to get a good job and be safe." And I don't know, there's something in me. And I think it was that I started to surround myself with people who win, who've won, or who are winning, I should say, in life. Disruptors, people who are very countercultural and counter narrative, and people who are entrepreneurial and didn't really go the safe route and the conventional route. So I started to like really hang around those kind of people, and I started to listen to like people like Tony Robbins and Joe Dispenza and Jim Rohn and all the OGs, and they were really showing me, and I really think that in a way they saved my life because they really showed me an alternative perspective that I wasn't a victim. And not only was I not a victim, but I hold the keys to be able to gain control of my life. And if I just start making enough of the right decisions and disrupting that unhealthy pattern that I was living in, then sooner or later the wins would start compounding and I could set myself free. So I really think that they had, maybe the most pivotal impact and maybe were the catalyst on my journey. And that's eventually what I did was just go on a relentless and obsessive journey. I'm a very all or nothing person. I can get obsessed with unhealthy things and I can get obsessed with healthy things. So I started to get obsessed with personal growth and winning. And it wasn't pretty. Okay, it was not poetic, it wasn't romantic, it was up, down, all around, but I just kept going. Winston Churchill says one of my favorite quotes, success is going from failure to failure without the loss of enthusiasm. And for whatever reason, that's what I've always been so good at is maintaining enthusiasm despite the failures. It's not that I don't go low, it's not that I don't feel the full spectrum of the human experience and start feeling all the negative emotions, and not that I don't feel like a victim sometimes, but for whatever reason, I can always pick myself back up and realize that you either win or you learn. And I just take what I learned and I just kept going. I had 6 failed businesses. I failed a lot of different like ways of eating that I tried, but I just kept going. And then I started to feel really good and I started to get obsessed with that feeling. So then I opened up, the first successful business I had was a couple of gyms. I opened up one and then we ended up opening up a second location, and it was successful, but I ended up just buying myself a job basically. And I actually realized that it was rooted, my ambition was rooted in a really deep inferiority complex that I still have to a certain degree. And we can talk about that later. I think all successful people have it, but it's not my main driver anymore. It was my main driver back then. And I ended up realizing, like, shit, I'm only doing this because I feel inferior. I'm trying to prove to my dad that he should say he's proud of me and he loves me. And because I didn't graduate high school, I'm trying to prove that I'm smart and people are patting me on the back, but I'm unhappy. I don't want to wake up and get into my day. I'm not stoked about my life. So I ended up transitioning out of that. And then I became a coach online. And that's where I started to build the business that I was meant to build. And I remember specifically sitting down and being like, I need to make sure that my main driver isn't to please others and to do what I think others are going to validate me for. I need to show up and build something that is largely something that I actually want to do and put the focus not on me, but on being of service to others. And I know that sounds like super cheesy and like, Kaylor, you're just saying that. Maybe I didn't say it in those words. I just remember being like, I just can't care about people's opinions so much. I need to like do something that actually is authentic to me, that actually genuinely serves an audience and serves people and helps people win. So that's what I did. I went on social media on April 8th, 2021, and I put out a 9-minute video, a 9-minute rant about COVID and just all the bullshit, the vaccines, the masks. Like I really went for it and I called it Enough is Enough. And that changed my life forever. And this is why you had resistance to me at first, Deidre, because after I put out that video, it went like mega viral. And I'm talking like CBC had like university professors on debunking my video. And there was a professor at the University of Calgary that did a dissertation that talked about me being a narcissist through my social media. I've lost friend groups. I've lost, some of the people that were closest to me. There was a petition in Edmonton that was started to get my Instagram shut down. And the reason being is because it was one of the first videos that really called out the bullshit. But what I did was I ended up realizing something. And this is the last thing I'll say. I ended up realizing that if you want to build a presence online, because largely I wanted to serve an audience. It's actually not so much about you. You absolutely need to post things that are authentic to you, but you need to find that part of you that is the most, it's not about being yourself as much as it's about being that part of you that is the most extra, the most entertaining, and that people are genuinely telling you they want to hear from you about. Like, what do they want to hear from you? And when I did that rant, I realized that this fight that we're in, this revolution that we're in, this battle, this war, whatever you want to call it, there's so many different pieces to the puzzle. There is the mother energy. There's the people who actually have to heal the divide and be more of in the feminine and bring people together. There's more people, there's a lot of people who need to be a more feminine energy to come in and actually help speak to the feelings and the emotions that people are going through during this disruptive time. I realized that my role in all of this is I'm a masculine warrior, and I am not to completely deny any of the feminine, but I am the one that comes in and makes you think and makes you feel. And I'm okay when people come and say, ooh, at first I'm like, wow, you're a little much. I want that. That's that part of me that I want to go on Instagram and express. It's not the only part of me. And this is why some people go out for coffee with me and they're like, wow, you're a little different than I thought because I've only seen your Instagram. What's going on? And I'm like, well, what did you expect me to rant in your ear about Justin Trudeau? Like, you know, this is a part of me that is authentic to me, but it's my disruptive warrior part of me. And that comes out from time to time. And it's what largely comes out on my Instagram, but there's way more parts to me. I'm a big parts guy. I believe we all have different authentic parts to us. So that's what I've ultimately done and I continue to do. And now we've helped a lot of people build confidence, break free, and build businesses that actually set them free as well too. So
Yeah.
that's the intro.
I love the story for there's just so many pieces to it. I started highlighting things over here because I'm like, you said a lot of stuff. Okay. So it's interesting because social media, it's just a snapshot. And it wasn't that you were talking about COVID or anything like that. I just think like every video was so intense and I'm a very intense person. But you're also a man that's intense, right? So I was like, whoa. And I just got glimpses of a lot of passion from a lot of different speakers. And then I went there to the event and I spoke on stage and I was like, oh, I fit right in because I'm a truth teller, right? And then I got to know you a little bit over the events and I was like, oh, there's depth to you, there's different ranges. And I understand that it's easy to make assumptions about people. We all do it. But also, are we curious enough to get to know someone and, get out of our own projections of who we think they are? So just wanted to bring that in here because we had a good conversation at Sarah Swain's event. And I was like, you know what? I feel like you actually have a lot of vulnerability to you and a really big heart. And I feel like you're really here to help people heal, but you just have that intense warrior energy about you. Do you know what I mean? So that's what
Yeah,
I'm picking up.
and on Instagram, like, look, I'm a business guy, so
Of
I
course.
mean, I'm not gonna hide the fact that Instagram is very strategic for me. So for me, Instagram is the hook to bring in the type of people I'm trying to attract
Of
so I
course.
can then get them into my pipeline so I can eventually go deeper with them and actually help them, create confidence and create freedom ultimately.
Mhm.
And so it's hooky. I mean, and I think also people only sometimes see the videos that really go viral or get pushed out, and those are often the ones where I'm ranting.
Yeah.
But if you look at some of the other, and by the way, I will say, no question, some of my videos were probably projecting or came from wounding or anger or frustration, or an unhealthy place, let's say. Like I'm not going to sit here and deny that either. Um, and I think that it's the front end, it's the hook. It's like, let me disrupt and call out the bullshit that a lot of people are afraid to say. And then that attracts the right people, awake individuals who have
Hmm.
the same worldview. And then, yeah, and then what we do for the rest of the process, goes much deeper than that. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah. I appreciate you breaking that down. And on that note, with One of the things that really stood out when we were at Kid Carson's first event, I think we've spoken on like three, maybe four stages together now in the last like year and a bit. But you really spoke about belonging versus authenticity. And a lot of women, so this is a show all about the feminine, but you are one of the few masculine people that I'm bringing on, just because I felt like there's a resonance here, the awakening, showing up, being powerful. A lot of women have a lot of trauma and experiences of not feeling safe to speak their truth, not putting themselves out there. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you, when the media started ripping you apart, when your life started kind of falling apart, maybe that's what it felt like in the moment, and everyone was, against you speaking your truth. How did you pick yourself up? What were some of the things that you did? Because I know personally, like when my TEDx went out and when certain things went out and I got, hundreds of thousands of views, people start attacking you and it's really intense. And no one really prepares you for that. There's not a lot of people talking about that. So I'd love to hear some tools and some processes and what you did.
Yeah, there was a few things. So I heard a really good quote the other day that said the only difference between excitement and anxiety is breath. So when you're anxious, you hold your breath. But in the body, it's very like physiologically and from a nervous system standpoint, hormonal standpoint, neurotransmitter standpoint, they're very much the same in the body if you were just measuring those metrics. But when you're excited, you're just breathing because there's just not as it's just a shift in perspective. So for me, I think that's what it was thank God, because if I wasn't at a point where I could perceive it this way, I might have ended up in the mental hospital. Like truly, like it brought me to my knees. I couldn't eat or sleep that week because mine and most people who've had this experience, it was very much all in like 2 weeks. It was very strong for 2 weeks. The temperature was high. And there's just something innately in our wiring that just makes us feel unsafe because, gosh, if we were ousted by our tribes for most of human history, we were thrown to the wolves. It was very much life or death. So there's something very innately in me that felt really anxious and fearful. But I just recognized that I just have to breathe. And I can actually more perceive this as exciting. Like I started to think of all the people I look up to the most. I started to think of a Jordan Peterson, for example. And look, any of the people I mentioned that I look up to, do I agree with everything that they say 100%? No, but I have a lot of tolerance for the fact that we all have different opinions on things. But largely, I look up to a Jordan Peterson because, he says a lot of great things. And I think he's helped the world and especially young men. And I think that he has been willing to offend for truth. And he's gotten heavily attacked. So I just started focusing on, well, gosh, I mean, if I'm really set out on a mission to like move mountains here, then and if I look at all the people I look up to the most, they all have way more hate than I do, and they're like vehemently under attack. So if that's the case, shouldn't I embrace this? Shouldn't this actually just be, rather than something I perpetually fear, shouldn't this just be something I embrace? Because isn't this like just a cost of entry to doing something meaningful? Yeah, I think it is. So that's how I perceived it. And I just realized that, like, look, you know, sometimes you said when things are falling apart, it certainly felt like things were falling apart. But I also remember hearing that quote while I was going through this, that sometimes when everything seems to be falling apart, it's just that it needs to, so it could be put together back into place, into more alignment. And that's honestly what I needed to go through. And I was watching the Martha Stewart documentary recently, and she said the same thing, when she went to jail. She said her greatest fear was everyone hating her. Her greatest fear was a ruining of her reputation. And she ended up facing her greatest fear. And because she faced it and she regulated through it and was all in one piece the next day or the next year, and the sun kept rising, it set her free. And that's honestly why my life changed after that post, as silly as it sounds, because I went through my greatest fear and I realized that I could get through it. And when you go through your greatest fear, you actually end up realizing that your greatest fear is evidence of where your true liberation lies. It lies just on the other side of it. That's why they say the obstacle is the way. This is why I tell anyone who has a really big fear, if they're a people pleaser, perfectionist, if they have a really great fear of rejection, criticism, judgment, abandonment, or shame, the obstacle is the way. The only way to regulate through that and free yourself from that is through.
Hmm. That's so powerful. And it's funny because I'm thinking about, for me personally, I'm an Aries and I'm just very intense. I have a very intense personality, people that know me well. And I just jump into things that I'm afraid of. Like, I don't even think about it. And then I'm like learning how to swim and I'm like, oh shit, I'm figuring it out. And that's one of the reasons why I've been able to do a lot of the things that I've been able to do. And it takes courage. But a lot of people they wait on the sidelines and they're like, oh, when it feels better or when I'm more equipped or when I'm this, when I'm that. And I just say, every single thing that I've personally done, it's because I've just ripped off the Band-Aid, I've jumped in, I've made mistakes, I've failed many times, and then I figured it out. So is there a process that you take people through, or is it more like just do it? Like, what is your process when you're coaching people who are, I have this fear, I want to do it. Like, how do you work with people in that way? Because I just tell people to rip off the Band-Aid. Just do the thing now. Don't think about it.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is just because your feelings are valid, it doesn't mean they should dictate your behavior. So I'll summarize it with that. I don't let my feelings dictate my behavior. It's been one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. In fact, I would say you could essentially hone it all in to that alone, in that the reason why I feel like I've set myself free in so many ways in my life is I don't let my feelings dictate my behavior. Now, the key part of that quote is your feelings are valid. So that doesn't mean you just dismiss your feelings. Like, I am of the belief that you can't stuff your feelings under the rug, because if you're doing that, you're stuffing them deep into the subconscious and then they come out unknowingly and unconsciously in not great ways. That's when you start reaching for the bottle, or you start getting anger issues, or you know, relationship issues. So it's not that you deny your feelings, it's that you embrace them, welcome them, hold space for them, feel them to heal them. But then when you come back to reality, then you got to just make the decision that aligns with your long-term values and commitments, rather than make a decision based off how you feel in the moment. Now, this is going to be a pretty aggressive masculine approach, but I love what Alex Hormozy says. He says, fuck your mood, follow the plan. I have a plan. I know what I want to execute in this life. And I just don't really concern myself on whether or not I feel like doing it. I mean, fuck, if I went off how I felt about going to the gym every day, I wouldn't be fit.
Hmm.
I mean, I know that's kind of the cliche classic example, but if you apply that then to every other aspect of your life, you end up realizing the superpower that we as humans have, which is unlike any other animal on earth, is that we can actually not feel like doing something and still do it. A deer can't do that. When a deer doesn't feel like doing something, it just runs off that automatic computer like program and it just doesn't do it, because everything is safety and survival. The problem is not the problem, the challenge is that we run off the wiring. Still to this day, we run off the wiring that we did for most of human history that kept us alive, because everything was life or death. Everything. But we live in an environment where very few things are life and death. So don't run off your survival program and let it tell you the lie that posting on Instagram and being authentic or being seen or putting yourself out there or whatever, don't let it lie to you and suggest that it's for survival. It's not. You're going to be okay.
Hmm. What I really like about this too, what you're saying is, you know, one of the things that I share is do the thing that you're afraid to do if it's in business, because I coach in business as well. It's do the thing that you're afraid to do or that you don't feel like doing or you think you're going to suck at, and just be the scientist with it, because until you collect enough external data, you're just guessing. And so I really like that. And it's interesting because something that's really bothered me, like really irritated me over the past 5 years. I used to teach on trauma. That's what I did my TEDx on. That's what I wrote a lot about in the book. And trauma is there's lots of different types of trauma. There's lots of different layers to it. But essentially, when we heal our trauma, we reveal our greatest gifts for humanity. And everything I've created, every course or program or anything has been from a trauma that I've healed. And then it's like, oh, there's a gift. But what I've seen externally over the past 5 years is people are getting addicted to their trauma and their stories and their pain more than ever, that I actually kind of took myself out of the game online talking about it, because I was talking about it before it was very much out there, because I was like, I can't even deal with all this emotional stuff and like the war that was going on online with people's emotions. And I took myself out of the conversation around trauma because I'm like, this is so unhealthy. And so I really appreciate your perspective around your feelings. They're valid. You can deal with them. Our emotions are only like, they last about, a minute and a half if we actually feel it. But there's this addiction to our story, our pain, and our trauma. And to me, energetically, it just started to gross me out. So I stepped out of some of those conversations because I'm like, it actually isn't that. And then people were capitalizing on, oh, you need to do this, this, and this, and this, and you're going to feel like this forever. I'm like, actually, I've helped people heal their traumas in like, 5 minutes, and they're fine. And there's going to be, triggers and stuff come up because there's physical, mental, emotional, energetic, spiritually, there's different layers to it. But it's like freedom is actually can happen really quickly when we're doing the right work. But that conversation online was a conversation I took myself out of because I'm like, I don't even know how to have a conversation about this because people are becoming addicted to this. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like,
I could not agree with you more. Look,
yeah.
I am absolutely on board with the theory of trauma. I think it's
Mhm.
irrefutable that trauma has an effect on our nervous system and then therefore our physiology and then therefore our life. But my gosh, I'm exhausted. And this is what the personal growth space loves to do. This is what the healing space loves to do, is they like to take something that we do need to talk about, that we do need to address, and they love to just go, this is just human nature. They go to the extreme with it,
Mhm.
right? It's like wokeism is a great example. Being woke is actually fundamentally, I'd say, like inclusivity, diversity, like tolerance, like these things inherently I think are great things, but holy shit. And then this is human nature. They just take it to the absolute extreme to now to
Yeah.
a point where it's actually destructive. And that's what, this industry has done a lot. A lot of practitioners have done the same thing about trauma. And I couldn't agree with you more. It's like it's bypassing. So they take trauma and they actually use it as a way to bypass the real work. It's so counterintuitive and paradoxical because it's like they're using the thing that they actually need to heal to actually bypass the healing, right?
Yeah.
Because where is the healing? Look, the only way to heal trauma is to, with tolerable steps, build your capacity to show your body that and your nervous system that it's safe to be with the wound that you are inevitably, that inevitably has been from the trauma that you experienced. So the only way to beat an anxiety, a wound, a trauma is to ultimately face it. And yes, you have to be, smart about that, strategic about that. That's why I mentioned the tolerable steps. Yes, you have to feel it and you have to acknowledge the emotional aspect of that. But look, what I experienced was a trauma, right? I was very deeply wounded and very deeply fearful of being judged and criticized, from my childhood. And that came from my childhood. And we won't get into why, but there's a whole story there. And what set me free? Facing it. Now, I wouldn't recommend going into the deep end like I did. I mean, I was just kind of forced because of a viral video. But man, I've seen this happen all the time. People, and this is another thing too, is so many people say it's really hard to distinguish and discern between a trauma response and intuition. So a lot of people say, this doesn't feel aligned. I don't feel like my intuition is telling me. And often, not always, because some people are really tapped into their intuition, but often it's actually just a trauma response. You're actually just afraid and you resist it because you're running off that wiring that is your survival DNA that's telling you, don't step into this because we don't want to open up that wound ever again. When in actuality, it's in opening up the wound a little bit with tolerable steps that would build your capacity to be with it and set you free.
So well said. And It's interesting because there's the trauma. So there's an image, a thought, a body sensation, emotion that gets locked in when we have a trauma, which is just a frozen moment in time. That's all it is. And it's hasn't been unfrozen. So we're walking around getting triggered subconsciously, energetically, all the things by people, circumstances, like the world, right? Online, right? And when we face it, just like you said, there's a trauma process that I work with my clients here and there when they get stuck. And essentially, it's just going back to the trauma or traumas associated with the main event and actually fully feeling in that moment, because that's what didn't happen with the trauma is it wasn't actually felt. And then after that, minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, it's like, oh, it's out of my system. But then it turns into discernment and wisdom and gifts. And it's interesting because when we look at, and I have something here I want to dive into with you that you mentioned earlier in your story is, there's trauma, which is a negative experience and, can keep us small and making excuses. And is this trauma? Is this intuition? There's so many pieces there. And then there's an imprint, which can be a positive experience, like maybe your dad or your mom giving you affirmation when you're the best. And so it's like now you build a life, and I see this a lot with high performers, you build a life around being successful, but then your health, your relationships, and everything else suffers. And it's actually the same thing. It's just a different experience. So on that note, I love to hear a little bit about, you shared something vulnerable when you were sharing your story, and it may not feel vulnerable to you anymore because you shared it, but there's a lot of women listening to this and they're going to feel like, I love this. So let's dive into it for them. You were chasing validation from your father, and that's why you were trying to become the best. Very similar story here. I'd love to hear a little bit about how that started to play out in your life. And when you realized, oh, I'm doing this for external validation versus my true aligned path. And how did you know the difference?
Yeah, like I have a relationship with my father still to this day, but it's just a very complicated and tricky relationship. Because me and my dad are very different, although we are very similar as well too in many ways. And yeah, I ended up realizing like, look, my dad and I, before I get into this, I'll preface this with like, I've really done a lot of work on not forgiveness. I actually have worked on accepting that my relationship with my dad has been this way. And the reason why I've reframed it from not forgiving and stepped into more acceptance is because forgiving, I think, is pretty hierarchical. Like it can be egoic if you don't treat it in the right way. Cause it's kind of like saying like, well, I'm up here and you're kind of pointing your finger down at them and saying, well, you did wrong and I'm going to forgive you, which sounds a little bit entitled, right? Um, because I don't think it's that simple. So I don't know that you can ever really fully accept if you just focus on forgiveness. I know this is a controversial topic, but what I found more useful personally is to actually just accept the situation. So surrender to it, accept the fact, and loosen my attachment, actually completely detach from any sort of outcome that I was waiting for my dad. And that outcome was I wanted to build a father-son bond that I feel like we've never built. And my dad's never told excuse me, my dad's never told me he's proud of me. He's never told me that he loves me, maybe when we were young, but I don't have any specific examples, and he's just not a very like open guy, right? So I think there's a few aspects there. First off, I noticed that one of the reasons why I was stepping into unhealthy patterns is because his lack of love, care, and acceptance and approval made me feel inadequate because I was basing my adequacy off of his approval. So that made me really struggle with confidence. So therefore, the way I dealt with that was reaching for substances and being a degenerate, like I said. But also, it was getting addicted to achievement and burning myself out simply just for the reason to try and prove to him that I'm successful. So then I ended up realizing all of this. So I became conscious of my unconscious unhealthy patterns in that regard. And I woke up to the fact that, oh, this is why I feel inadequate. And this is why I keep getting addicted to these unhealthy ways of coping with it. So then all I did was consciously, I'm going to make it sound simple and oversimplified here, but all I did was then consciously interrupt those patterns and recognize a few things. Number one, I had to accept the fact that my dad has not maybe played the role that I have wanted him to build that father-son bond that I yearn for. But I switched it not only to acceptance, but I also included empathy in there. So instead of getting mad and angry and resentful towards him, what I did was I switched it to, oh, he's doing this because he's hurt. And my dad has his own battles that he's dealing with. It's not that he wants to be a shitty dad, and it's not even that I would consider him a shitty dad, but he's doing that because he's hurt. Now, what I also realized that was absolutely fucking game changing was that he just doesn't communicate it through his words. But what I noticed is that my dad will literally wake up in the middle of the night to come pick me up at the airport if I fly in. I noticed that he never missed a basketball game. He wiped my ass when I was a kid. He took me fishing and hunting, and you know, he's put up with my bullshit because I was a degenerate. So I ended up realizing, oh, he tells me that he loves me in other ways. I'm in a podcast studio right now, and I showed him a tour of it, and he was there. He came in, and again, it's kind of awkward because my dad's not open, and I don't think he really knew what to say because I don't really think he understands what I do. But he said, "Why don't you sit down and sit in front of your mic there?" And I said, "Okay." So I sat down, and then he pulls out his phone, and he's taking a photo of me. And I just realized in that moment, that's how my dad communicates that he's proud of me. Holy shit. Yeah, that's how my dad communicates that he's proud of me.
You're making me cry over here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that doesn't happen often, but it's healthy, so I'm gonna cry it out.
Yeah.
Um, but when I realized that, then I no longer yearned for his words. I just realized that love, acceptance, and communicating you're proud of your son can be communicated in other ways than words. So that really helped. And I know he's proud of me because I know that, he's showing that photo to his friends. And um as a man, I really think that women, and this is overgeneralizing and oversimplifying, but I really think that maybe the North Star for women is, I mean, you could speak to this better for me or better than me, but it seems to be what I've observed is that women really yearn to be loved. And it's not that men don't yearn to be loved, but man, what a man really yearns for, I can tell you right now, is to be respected and appreciated for what he does in in the external world, the mission that he has, whatever he builds, whatever fight he is taking on. And that's what I've now realized that I can get from my dad just through a means that I just wasn't aware of. I was expecting it from words. Now I'm working on having those conversations with him where I'm trying to get him to open up, and maybe I will get those words. But then this now transitions into the last piece, which is, especially now that I know deep down my dad loves me, he just has some barriers of his own that prevent him from being able to communicate or, show me. But I also have to realize that to a large extent, I have to divorce myself and detach myself from needing that, and how that feeling of feeling respected for what I do in this world and feeling adequate can also largely come from me. And that really, at the end of the day, what hurts about the things I've gone through with my dad are only that it's really what I use it as a metric to reflect back on me. I use it as a mirror to reflect back on me, but I can actually learn to accept the fact that I actually don't need the father son bond. I don't need my dad to say I'm proud of me and that he loves me, because I can create that feeling within. And quite honestly, I can realize that I'm adequate despite any of the lack of communication in that regard or any of those things that he expresses to me. And then when I see them, then they're just the icing on the cake. You know,
Mm.
it's a nice, beautiful additive. It's kind of similar to a union, right? Like if you don't truly build a healthy, strong, sexy relationship with yourself and feel adequate and build a life where you feel, you know, like you have worth, you can't step into a union in a relationship, because then you're ultimately going to be depending so aggressively on them to fill those voids for you.
Mhm.
So that's what I realized. And it's the process I'm still going through with my dad. I think the tears that I have are evidence of that I'm not 100% there, and I don't know that I ever will be, but man, I've come a long ways.
Wow, that was really beautiful just to witness because as you were telling the story, I started to get really emotional and I was like, and you weren't emotional yet. No, I was tearing up over here. I'm like, oh man, like this is really sweet. And to witness you almost, it was almost like a locking in energetically of this is how my dad loves me. It's like I know that so many people who are listening and watching and myself included, it's the realization of people love us in different ways and it's about understanding the language that they love us and being like, oh, that's how they love. And so that was really beautiful to witness. So thank you for being vulnerable and sharing and yeah, opening yourself up because how many people can relate to that with their mother or their father, or their relationship that they're in. So that just
There,
shows you've done a lot of work on yourself to be able to be vulnerable like that in this conversation. So thank you.
I'll be honest though, there must be something about you, Deidre, because I can't say that that's ever happened. I've talked a lot about my dad, and
Mhm.
yeah, I can't say that that's just the flood of emotions that I felt. I can't say I can't say I've actually felt that on a podcast at the very least. So
Yeah.
maybe that's kudos to you.
Oh, thanks. People are always vulnerable with me. I think it's just who I am. But I appreciate you sharing. It's very sweet. It's very
Of course.
sweet.
And it's
Um,
healing, by the way. I also just want to say this. I I'm gonna say something controversial in that. Well, I'll say the less controversial thing first. Look, it's so funny how we have this instinct of when people are crying, the first thing we tell them to do is, "Oh, it's okay," and we try and get them to stop crying. It's incredibly healing. Like what I just went through was actually a really healing, because again, feel it to heal it. Now, I will say men have to be careful with this, and this now steps into like there's a harmony to this, and this is where people love to take things too far. If I'm showing up in every conversation with a woman and crying and talking about my feelings and wanting to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, then you're eventually going to get to a point where now you're not actually, stepping into your masculine and being able to step into the doing, the achieving, the building, the conquering, and everything that is required from stepping into that leading and dominant masculine role. But there is certainly no shame in having moments like that, and they're very healing, no question.
yeah, thank you for sharing that. Wow, I feel like just something just clicked. Just you're opening your heart. It's nice. It's nice to see. Yeah, I think it's so nice to hear your reflection of your conversation with your dad and him taking that picture of you. And we actually have a very similar background. I had a fitness company for 8 years and then I got into coaching and I was I was married. I got really sick. I had my wake up call, and then that got me into like the spiritual and business development world that I'm in now. And it's just interesting to see people go through different phases and pieces. And the overachievement piece, I had this really interesting moment. Probably like it was like 2 or 3 years ago. I was living in Mexico, and I was working with this incredible coach out of Australia, and I was wanting to scale my business at the time, and that was a big thing. And I was working on my book and a few other things. And she got me to slow down and do basically nothing for the whole time I was working with her, like down to like 2 hours a day. And I was like a workaholic. I was like, do, achieve, achieve, achieve. And I was slowing down, and I really had to meet a lot of this shit that we're talking about around like, oh, if I'm not doing this, then what value do I have? And it really was an ego death in so many ways. And it connected back to childhood. And, my parents and my dad used to give me money every time I'd shoot a goal in soccer. So I became a striker, and I was like so good at sports. And if I wasn't the best, don't even talk about it. So it's been like this interesting subconscious belief system around, if I'm not the best, don't talk about it. But like, if I'm the best, well, then I have to like, there's so many different degrees of internal experiences of it. And I just feel like I can really connect with you on this. So thank you for sharing all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the conditioning that we get as a child where it's like the way in which I get love, care, and attention in this world is to show up and please the people around me and to
Mm,
achieve and to, and it's this, Peter Crone talks about this. It's this agreement that we have. The first agreement that we have in our lives is to essentially self-suppress and self-abandon,
mhm,
or, because your parents inevitably say, hey, you got to show up in this way, and you got to, essentially put your authentic self on the back burner to show up and please me and my friends and the people around me and your teachers and the principal and grandma and grandpa and all these people. And then we'll give you not just love, care, and attention. We'll give you your basic needs. We'll feed you. We'll house you. Well, otherwise you're going to your room and you're gonna have to, cry your eyes out. So it's this agreement we make. It's the way we're conditioned. And look, I think that it's a tricky it's not a balance. It's a tricky harmony to strike, because I will say that my inferiority complex and my trauma has also served me very well. I mean,
right.
a lot of my success has come from it. Now,
Yeah.
the way I look at it is once you're conscious of it, then it's a monster that you can manage. So
Mhm,
I'm going to say something controversial in that I think that as long as you're conscious of it and you're not blind to it, you're not unconsciously reacting to it, and you're actually responding to it, it is actually a tool you can leverage. It's that thing that makes me put an extra hour or two in when I want to stop. It's when I'm at the gym and I'm like wanting to put the weight down because it's really burning, and it just gets me that one extra or two extra reps. Now, because I'm conscious of it and I can manage that monster, then I better know how to leverage it to get a return out of it, and it doesn't overtake everything, and I don't take it too far. Gone are the days of me burning out. I
mhm,
truly like don't even think I can burn out anymore. I'm just so conscious of the monster. So I don't want to demonize it like we have to make it fully go away. It just can't be the main driver, and we certainly can't be unaware of it.
mhm. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's how I like to teach is our personality versus our true identity. Our true identity is whatever we choose we want to be and step into. And then there's our personality, which is like our trauma, our childhood, our parents, and all of that. And we can use it to be a superpower. So I love that you shared that your trauma is like part of your greatest gifts, and that's why you're so successful. And it's about doing it from a place of awareness rather than pain driving the show. So I love that.
And if we look at how we heal trauma, again, I'm oversimplifying, but it's to shift your perspective on it. It's to build your capacity and show your nervous system that it's actually safe. It's not unsafe to fill in the blank, whatever your trauma is, to be with whatever your wound is. So
Mhm,
if we look at it as, that's why I like your frame, because it's like, if we look at it as like, some people call it your inner child, right? If we look at it as like, okay, this is your personality, this is who you are, and this is where all the the shadows, the insecurities, the fears, that's where all of this is. And it's not to be pushed away, it's not to be dismissed, it's not to be demonized. It's like it's a part of you. And when to me, that is acceptance of it. And it's in the acceptance of it and not being afraid of it and trying to push it away that actually counterintuitively allows you to heal from it. And that's why they say feel it to heal it.
Hmm.
So I think that's a good frame.
I love that. And just to talk a little bit about intuition versus trauma for a moment, trauma response. Do you want to share on your experience of the two, or should I jam on this? I'm curious on your perspective.
Well, I mean, I could give examples.
Mhm.
So for example, I mean, the two things that come to mind are business and relationships. I'm not a father yet, so I would imagine that having a child brings all of your bullshit to the surface. Um, I shouldn't call it bullshit. Some people aren't going to like that, but you know what I mean.
Fine.
So, I would say, okay, so in business, I mean, look, before I did that enough is enough video, there were so many things that I didn't step into because I was just afraid. And what I did was, because this is what our psychology is really good at, is we have the trauma and the wound and the fear come up, and then we have the feeling, and then we justify with logic why we should avoid it. So
Mhm.
like what I would do is, like, because I was so afraid of being seen, I remember when I had my gym, people were saying like, "Oh, you should like do more social media and you should put yourself out there and you should like do some online stuff." And even like my business mentors were like, "Man, you could grow and scale and make more of an impact and serve more and da 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 da." And I remember justifying as like, "Oh, I couldn't imagine doing virtual stuff. I need the connection. I need the in-person, connection and blah blah blah." Which there's some truth to that. I love that still to this day, but I really was just afraid. So
Mhm.
I would have said in that moment that that's my intuition saying, "No, I want to follow this path." But in actuality, deep down, I'm just actually afraid of putting myself out there and actually going for my dreams.
Mhm.
Now, I would also say we see this in relationships all the time as well too. Unfortunately, this is a very cliche situation where you get these beautiful girls who are with these duds of a guy who haven't healed yet, and I'm sure they have the potential to be an amazing man, as I believe every man does, but they're like degenerates, and they're partying all the time, and they're an asshole to her, and they're just a dick. And often it is, you wonder why is she with him, why does she choose him? And it's like, well, often it's because she's actually afraid to go after the guy who's healthy and her dream guy, because she's actually afraid of loss and losing love and being abandoned. So therefore, it's easier to go with the guy who's a dick, because when it doesn't work out, which would prove her internal belief anyways, then she can just say, well, he was a dick anyways.
This is so
Right.
accurate. This is so
Yeah.
true.
So, and this is why women are with guys who abuse them or whatever, it. So, yeah.
And
And
and self-worth too, like
self-worth.
worthiness.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, because it
trauma,
aligns with
what
that
your
belief.
dad
You
was
want what's
like.
familiar. You want
Exactly.
what's familiar, right? The
Mhm.
subconscious mind loves what's familiar, because what's familiar is safe. I mean, all you want to do is keep repeating the pattern. What better way to stay safe and survive than to just continue doing what I've always done that's brought me to safety and survival today?
Mhm.
So it may not make me happy, but at least I know what I'm going to get. And what I'm going to
Yeah.
get is safety and survival. If I step into the unfamiliar heaven, well, I don't know what I'm going to get from them. I might die, right? Think of most of
Yeah.
human history. You don't go for your dreams. There was no, vision boards that had G wagons on it, and I want to make 10K a month. Like that wasn't part of human history. It was, you stay with the familiar hell, and life was
Mhm.
hell. So that's why in today's world we still stay with the familiar hell.
Mhm.
We'll opt for that over an unfamiliar heaven just because it's familiar.
Powerful. It's so funny. The first thing I thought of when you were talking about familiar hell is I got out of a relationship like 6 years ago, and before that I was in an 8 year relationship and then a year and a half relationship. And I literally ran away from this guy that I liked because I had a lot of healing to do. Like I was in Bali on a scooter, scootering as fast as I could out of the city I was in. When this guy was, wanting to date me to be my boyfriend and all of that. And I remember going as fast as I could on my scooter out of town and having this moment like drop in of like, oh, like, what are you running away from? You're running away from what you want. And I wasn't ready for that. At the time, I had a lot of internal stuff to heal and shift, but that was a moment where I was like, I'm literally running away from an amazing guy because I am afraid. And I think we do that a lot in relationships, business opportunities, everything. And it's so easy to like, I don't know about you, you're probably really good at this too. When you do talk yourself out of something, because, Kaylor, you do a lot of the work. I do a lot of the work. A lot of us do. But if we were to logically tell someone why we're not doing something, they'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's not the right timing for that thing or whatever. But at the end of the day, we all have our patterns and we can get really tricky with it. So I'm curious. Oh, go ahead. You have something to say?
Well, just something that came to mind. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying.
Yeah.
Something that came to mind was I love when people tell me they want to build a business, but they're a private person. That's my favorite. I'm just going to call this one out right away.
Yeah, no, this is
You're
perfect. We
not
have a
a
lot of entrepreneurs listening. Yeah.
you're not a private person. Okay. I would say, look, I'm obviously things are nuanced. So I'm open to the fact that maybe one out of every 100 or 50 or whatever actually maybe is. And look, I also have parts of me that I don't want to share online. Like you don't have to share everything, but don't tell me you're a private person. You're fucking afraid to be seen,
Hmm.
right? Like you're not a private person. You're just afraid. And it sounds better to say, oh, I'm a private person. Like, look, I get it. It's hard for me to put stuff out there on the interwebs. It's look, we can totally, um, I can totally get on board with that. But yeah, that's my favorite one is I'm a private person. That's a good example of people justifying with logic why they aren't doing something instead of just admitting that they're afraid.
Or it's not the right time. I'm too busy.
Yes.
I'm like, are you always busy? Yeah. Okay. Well, you're
Yeah.
always busy not doing the thing. So you might as well just do the thing. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Yeah,
100%.
yeah. Well, it's been so great having you today. I'd love for you to share a little bit about what awake and winning means and anything else you feel called to share as we wrap up today's conversation.
Yeah, well, like, look, obviously, we are kind of black sheep. We see the world in a very different way. We don't really abide by like the conventional narrative out there. Let's call a spade, whether that be in health or government or the school system, business wise, career wise, financially. So that would be the awake part. It's to be awake to the lies that were being sold that I think are, really destructive to our society. And that's the way awake part. But why I ultimately created the Awake and Winning brand is because what I really noticed was a bit of I don't know, you could call it a gap in the market, maybe that like the quote unquote awake crowd. And I really try to not be shy when I say this, even though I'm sure it ruffles feathers or offends some people. But I noticed that a lot of awake people weren't winning. And it's not a judgment or like well, I suppose it's a judgment, but I'm not trying to judge you or shame you directly. I'm not trying to shame you for it because I've been there. Literally, this is my story. I was awake at one point, but I was an over awake underachiever. And I
Mm,
think that over awake underachieving is a crisis. And I want to really help people understand that, like, yes, 20 to 30 or maybe 10% of your freedom is in the external world. Yes, it has to do with Trudeau and, wokeism and socialism and progressivism and the WEF and big pharma, big food. Like, yes, but keyword 10, 20, maybe 30%. The rest of your freedom, 70, 80, 90%, lies in self-governance, the
mhm.
inner legislation that you need to do. And that's what winning is to really do everything we talked about in this conversation to go out and create this unbelievable, extraordinary life and actually set yourself free. So that's where the Awake and Winning brand comes from. It's like, yeah, let's talk about the awake stuff and all the BS that's going on in the external world, but do not think for a second that your freedom lies largely in the external world. It's an internal game.
And through the internal, externally, we can create what we want. And
Exactly.
yeah, and just to go to the awake piece for a moment, I'm a part, or I used to be a part of a lot of spiritual groups. And the amount of spiritual bypassing in it, for a couple years, I was like, I don't even want to be associated with being spiritual because, like, my greatest gift is I'm super connected. Like I'm very connected to all the things and, awakening her and all of that. But I stepped away from that externally because I was around so many people that were spiritually bypassing everything, shaming people for being successful. And it just wasn't resonating. And it was because of the amount of trauma that was being bypassed into the, hey, you have something here, but let's say everything's great and not do anything about it. Let's meditate and manifest the life, but I'm not willing to take any risks. If you want to be successful, if you want to be awakening, or you want to really create any kind of impact in the world, you have to take risks. You have to bet on yourself. You have to go all in on your dreams. And that's where I think your show and your work is kind of bridging that gap, and where my work does as well. It's about taking radical responsibility for your life, doing the internal work, and then showing up externally and saying yes to the things that you want to do, even if you're terrified, and then finding the right communities. So, yeah, thanks so much for being here today, Kaylor. It's been such a great conversation. Is there anything that you want to share with our listeners before we complete our conversation today?
No, just I heard a good quote. We are ghosts, and maybe you could say, let's say, spiritual beings, driving a meat covered skeleton made from stardust, riding a rock floating through space. Don't let fear get in the way and just take action. Let's end on that.